So now on to our last speaker for today, who is, I think we can say, a legendary software engineer. He's one of the original signatories of the Agile Manifesto. He's the creator of extreme programming, contributor of test-driven development, and has had a clear impact on how we, as an industry, write reliable and maintainable code. Please welcome to the stage, Beck.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm afraid I have to start by correcting you. I'm not a signatory of the Agile Manifesto. I am the first signatory of the Agile Manifesto, alphabetically. So, it's great to be back here. I was here pre-COVID, so 150 years ago. It just feels like forever walking around, and it was a different world. I think 2018, maybe? So, yeah, wow. Good to be here. I'm here with a new frame for an old set of messages. One of the things that surprised me about extreme programming and the way that it was received was the backlash. We're now there was a period where people would refer to the waterfall kind of ironically, kind of, oh yeah, well, I guess this is kind of waterfall. And we are now firmly into the realm of people putting their fists on their hips and saying, no, the waterfall, that's the way you develop software. And that's been a big surprise. Started out as a disappointment. Like, what did I do wrong? I thought we'd killed this dragon, and here it is again, eating the sheep and flying off with young people. And what I realized is that the way we develop software is not fully under our control. You can think, yeah, we could do this, we could do that. But in fact, the way we develop software is a shadow cast by the power structures that we live within. So if for example, orders come down and no feedback goes back up, you're going to end up with the kind of estimation practices that we see typically in the waterfall world. We're going to see people say, if only I had a clear, complete, concise, consistent specification, then all the rest of this stuff would be so easy. Which is something that I said probably in my 20s, but got over. But I'm hearing that kind of thing again. So one of the options for reintroducing extreme programming was just call it extreme programming version 3, new improved, now it'll make your teeth shiny. And I thought, yeah, that's not gonna go very well. And then I got lucky. My oldest, Beth, is a principal software engineer. I don't know where I went wrong, but there it is. And Beth was talking about a project one day, and she had discussed this project with Beth's manager, and the manager said, that would be a fine way to do this project if we lived in a forest, but we live in a desert. Bing! There was the idea. The metaphor for this difference between how a lot of people develop software. It doesn't make sense to me. Things like precise estimation, which is impossible on the face of it. And the way really effective teams, effective from my perspective, develop software. So we started developing this idea of the forest and the desert. And one of the things that I immediately loved about the metaphor was it gave me a way to appreciate people who do things in a different way than I do them. So I don't call the desert a bad way to develop software anymore. I think it has some serious disadvantages, but I can also appreciate that people who develop in the desert lack sufficient time, they lack skills, they lack time to gain skills, they lack a sense of community or purpose. They have perverse incentives to work in ways that just don't produce very much value. And yet, bless their hearts, people in the desert manage to make really valuable software. Now, I might think it's this much really valuable software, but one of the beauties of software is it's so ridiculously profitable that you can do a terrible job of developing software and still make a lot of money, which is another one of my frustrations. Because I don't mind if people don't do what I say in my books to do. I would just like them to fail. And they keep succeeding. So what I want to do today, rather than dig into here's the forest and what it looks like and where we can get with it, or here's what the desert looks like, what I want to do is emphasize this difference and the difficulty we have in communicating across the distinction between forest and desert. There are things that you say in the forest that just make no sense whatsoever in the desert and vice versa. So something like defect tracking. In the desert, you have lots of defects. You have a defect tracking tool. Probably your defect tracking tool is complicated enough that it has defects that also need to be tracked. And you have this long list. You know you'll never fix everything. You'll carefully triage the defects. The very worst ones go at the top. You'll do those. You'll be depressed about the whole rest of the list that you're never, ever going to get to. But at least you keep track of the defects. So in the desert, it makes a lot of sense to have defect tracking. In the forest, and this was one of the surprising emergent effects of extreme programming, many teams noticed that they just didn't have defects reported from production. Like maybe once every 6 months, once a year, there would be a defect. So in the forest, defect tracking, we have a defect or we don't have a defect. Those are the two states. If we have a defect, we're going to stop everything and make sure that and anything like it never, ever happens again. And then we have another year before we need to deal with the next defect. So the desert thinks these forest people with their no defect tracker thing are just have to be irresponsible. But from the forest, the question is, well, why is it that you're choosing to have defects? And it makes it really difficult to have a productive conversation. So what I wanted to focus on today is a few of these kind of distinctions between forest and desert and what makes it so hard to communicate between them. Oh, I have the clicker. Thank you, Gita. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a philosopher. He believed in the innate goodness of people. There's bad people. They're the exception. You have to be prepared to deal with them. But people are generally basically good. And if you start with that assumption, it leads you to a certain set of policies and behaviors and principles that follow from the fact that people want to do good things. Thomas Hobbes, by contrast, famously said that without coercion, man's life is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And that was the argument for having an overarching state that he made in the book Leviathan. So left to their own devices, people are going to be selfish, people are going to harm others, and they won't care about it. And that's the basic assumption in the desert. In the forest, leadership comes through purpose. So if you want things to happen, you find a way of identifying and communicating and reinforcing a shared purpose among all the people. Beth recently posted, when you have purpose, you don't need to tell people what to do. People will find a way to fit into the shared purpose. And this is another one of these, from the desert, that just sounds like some kumbaya bullshit. But in the forest, it makes perfect sense. If people are basically good and they share a purpose, mostly they're going to find a way to fit themselves into that purpose. Every once in a while, you're going to need a little nudge. So as I was listening to Gita, I was thinking, autonomous teams. I don't believe in autonomous teams. I believe in mostly autonomous teams. The last team that I managed, in the last year that I managed them, there were 3 occasions on which I had to provide more direct feedback on a mistake that was about to happen. So they aren't perfectly autonomous, but that was also a failure of my ability to communicate a purpose that people could fit into. In the desert world, the way you get people to do things is pressure. If you don't apply pressure, then people aren't going to work hard. That's the assumption in the desert, which is true in the desert. I had a post recently, and I had just the perfect reply. Somebody said, yeah, if you don't apply pressure, people just aren't going to work. And I thought, my first reaction is, hey, Buster. That wasn't the word I used, but. And then I thought, no, hang on. This guy's in the desert. In the desert, that statement makes perfect sense. It doesn't make sense for me in the forest, but bless his heart. So that's a bless your heart is a phrase they use in the Midwest of America, and it's really condescending. Is there a Swedish equivalent where you say, oh, bless your heart? Yeah, you understand what I'm getting at? Okay, so bless his heart. In his frame of reference, that's the only way you get people to do anything. In the forest, you embrace change because that's what's going to happen. That's the focus is on sensing what is to come next and what shift you need to make to adapt to that. And that makes sense in the forest, inside of a fixed and distant purpose, you're going to steer a little bit. Deming talks about fixity of purpose, within which we're going to make changes as the path reveals itself. And that makes sense in the forest because you're assuming that people basically want to do good things. They have a shared purpose. And now, as the changes happen, people will adapt to the changing situations. In the desert, you don't make those same assumptions. Instead, the important skill is careful prediction. Notice I said careful and not accurate. Because in the desert, the purpose of prediction is a momentary belief that you're going to be okay. Because being okay in the desert is never more than a fleeting sensation. And yet, bless their heart, people get a lot accomplished in the desert. But it's a clear distinction between the two. Me in the forest, if I think, wow, why are we spending 6 weeks planning a 2-week project? That makes no sense in the forest. You just get on with it. But in the desert, where you have this sense that there's just not enough to go around, and if we don't carefully plan to get to the next oasis, we're going to run out of water and die here. If that's our assumption, then you have to make a very careful plan, even though the dust storm comes and you have to figure out how to survive anyway. But without the plan, we might die. In the forest, you see community. And indeed, purpose and community, if I had to sum up the heart of the forest, that's the two things that form the trunk of the tree. There's another presentation I do sometimes where I've got the tree and it's got this trunk and it's purpose and community. That's the trunk. That's what holds everything up. And then there's the roots, which are programmers testing and continuous deployment and all that stuff. And then there's the fruit that comes on the top of it, which is no bugs, more features, starting sooner, more experience, more satisfaction. So in the forest, we have time for community. We have time to take care of each other. In the desert, we don't feel like we can do that. We need to exert control. How long is this going to take? 4 weeks. You only have 2 weeks. There. I have cut the schedule by half. I just doubled the productivity of the team. From a desert perspective, yes, you have. From a forest perspective, what? How does that make any sense? All of this comes to what I see after 25 whatever years of extreme programming. My greatest frustration is that people aren't sitting up at the table and eating cake. Software is this incredibly powerful, leveraged, valuable activity, and yet we're not taking full advantage of what it offers us. Instead, in the desert, we're content to eat crumbs off the floor. And this is the part that I just don't get. Apparently, the crumbs are pretty tasty because we stay there on the floor eating crumbs in the desert. What I'd like to point out is both of these are internally consistent belief systems. The beliefs work together, the principles work together, the practices work together to reinforce the system as a whole. So if you start with the assumption that people are basically trying to get away with what they can get away with, that we're probably going to die here, but maybe we can survive a little bit longer, that there's just not enough resource to go around, that our only chance of success is exerting greater control and making more accurate predictions, then crumbs come as a natural consequence of that whole belief system. It's internally consistent. I gotta say, looking out at the world of the software, it's also the dominant paradigm. This sense that software development should be like clockwork. You should wind it up, and you know that 12 hours from now, the clock has been around once. But The forest is also an internally consistent belief system. And there's a lot of ingredients that have to come together, starting with the belief in the innate goodness of people, with important exceptions. I promised myself I wasn't going to say anything political, and I almost broke my promise. So this is what we're looking at. I'll talk about that later. Two internally consistent belief systems, both of which create value, but in very different ways, and with a very different feeling when you're inside of one of them. One of the saddest experiences that I have is having people come up to me and tell me, you know what, I was on an extreme programming team from 2003 to 2005, and they were the best years of my career. And the first time somebody did that, I just broke down crying. Why should 3 years out of a 30-year career actually be fulfilling? There is something deeply wrong about that. Now, you can still have a career in the desert. It's just not going to be the same kind of feel. You're not going to have the chance to learn and grow in that kind of environment. But 3 years out of 30, that's just not okay. So as I said, there are lots of topics that when we try and talk about them across forest to desert, just things get lost. So here are a few examples. One of them that's come up recently, people want to measure developer productivity. In the desert, we want to measure developer productivity because we want to get rid of the least productive developers. Because if you have 10 developers, one of them is going to be the least productive developer. And after all, if we're trying to get to the oasis with any water and we have somebody who's drinking water and they're not actually producing for us, getting rid of them is going to increase our chances of success because there's just not enough to go around. So out come the metrics. People forget about Goodhart's law. You know, Goodhart's, when a measure becomes a goal, it ceases to be a measure. Turns out Goodhart was actually an optimist. It's worse than that. When a measure becomes a goal, people will screw up the surrounding system in order to reach that goal. It's not just that the measure ceases to have meaning. It's that the attempt to reach the goal causes you to mess up everything else. So, code coverage. There's a number that just, it can be informative, but pursuing a goal of a certain code coverage means you have people writing tests with no assertions. They can't fail just so that you execute some line of code. Whether it executes correctly or not, who cares? That's desert kind of behavior with respect to metrics. As soon as you've got that goal, you'll try and reach the goal and forget the purpose. In the forest, it's not that I'm anti-metric or the forest is anti-metric. No, metrics are a fabulous way of gaining self-knowledge. I was addicted to metrics when I wrote the test-driven development book. One of my examples in there was writing a testing framework, TDD style, that tested itself, which is a pretty twisted thing to do, I understand. But one of the good things I did is I kept track of every time I ran the tests as I was developing the testing framework to test itself. And when I was done, I could look and say, oh, I run tests about once a minute. Oh, well, that's interesting. Oh, but here's this gap. What happened in that gap? And I can go and look at it and say, what was it about my workflow that made it so I didn't run tests for 5 minutes? And learn something about what I was doing. Metrics are fabulous as tools for self-knowledge. In the forest, we want metrics, but we use them as learning tools. In the desert, we want metrics, but we use them for judgment. Because you got to judge other people or we may not make it to the next oasis. So, still metrics, but try having a conversation between those two universes. It's just not going to go very well. People in the desert are rightly going to be suspicious of, why are you gathering this information? How is this going to be used against me? In the forest, you just say, oh, well, of course, oh, that sounds interesting. I'd like to know how I'm doing. I'd even like to know how I compare with other people or how my team compares with other teams. But as soon as you fire the team with the lowest code coverage score, the wheels come off and then anyway, productivity. That's a whole nother rant. Maybe I'll tack that one on. Dependencies is another interesting technique. In the desert, we use dependencies. The most important thing in the desert is not to get blamed. In the desert, you have downside and you have no upside. And the more you can eliminate your downside, the more successful you're going to be. That's how it works in the desert. Dependencies in the desert are fantastic because it means you cannot deliver and it's somebody else's fault. So you have this automatic out. Oh, this is great. In the forest, if it's a true dependency, you just don't take it. If my team requires your team's delivery in order for me to deliver, you're building some service, I have to call it before I can deliver, I'm going to wait to start until after you've delivered. That's a natural decoupling thing to do in the forest. Why wouldn't you? Oh, well, but you're not going to deliver as soon as you can. Yeah, but I don't want to stay up nights wondering about whether your team is going to deliver or not, so I'll just wait. It'll be fine. Maybe I need some functionality of what you're doing. So maybe I build a little version of what you're working on. Now the dependency is broken. Or maybe a couple of people from my team go to your team and accelerate the development that you're doing. Those are all valid ways of dealing with the dependency in the forest. Now in the desert, are we going to loan 2 of our valuable people to your loser project? Absolutely not. That lowers our chance of success and lowers our chance of blaming you when something goes wrong. I'm sorry to be picking on you, sir. We both have God's hairstyle, so. Some more. Compliance. In the desert, compliance is a bar that you have to step over or maybe jump over. And it's valuable if we can push that bar a little bit lower. That gives us the chance to get over that bar if we possibly can. So if we can, I was going to say cheat. If we can shave a little bit off of the requirements of compliance and not get blamed for it, we win. That's in the desert. And that's a reasonable strategy in the desert. Compliance is a separate organization. They have authority without responsibility. They can stop our products from going into the market, and there's nothing we can do about it. We treat them as adversaries because they are adversaries in the desert. In the forest, compliance is a source of lessons to be learned. The auditors who govern compliance are actual human beings. Always a useful thing to remember. All these other people who are doing all these strange things, they're actually human beings too. My life took a big positive turn when I learned to stop saying asshole and start saying child of God. Compliance people are people too. There's a life insurance company I've worked with for 25 years, and I'm actually going to visit them in Barcelona next week, who are very focused on product iteration in insurance. And it may not be medical devices, but it's one step below in terms of auditing and compliance and regulatory oversight. And LifeWare's current record for introducing a new insurance product was the idea popped up Friday morning, and Monday afternoon, they sold the first contract. Completely legit, not the Silicon Valley way. Not just like taking somebody's cash on the street and saying, oh, we got you. No, this was a fully compliant, audited, regulated product, went through the entire process, including implementation, product design, regulatory approval, enough marketing to sell one contract, and the sale of the first contract in 48 hours. That's the forest. And that's what comes of not treating compliance as the bad guys that we're trying to shave off as much of their requirements as necessary, but building strong relationships with the auditors, strong ongoing relationships so that we treat them as a resource in delivering the benefits of insurance products to the wider society. It also informs product design. Most product design in insurance is intended to maximize profitability. There, I said that such a nice way. Maximize profitability in ways that the purchaser of the contract perhaps isn't fully aware of at the time. Insurance people are sneaky as hell. So, simple insurance products, the terms and conditions on an insurance product oftentimes run to 100 pages. LifeWare's terms and conditions are on one page of plain language. Now, it means that they're theoretically not protected from all of the million corner cases that are covered by that 100 pages, but if we're trying out lots of products, who cares? If we have 10 contracts and there's some loophole and it's cost us a little bit of money, it's fine. If we can launch an insurance product, new insurance product in 48 hours instead of 9 months or 12 months. And in fact, that one-page terms and conditions, that's just the current record. The goal is to have a comic book, to have cartoons that illustrate the terms and conditions, and that's all that there is. But in the desert, compliance is the bad guys, and they're trying to keep our just fine products out of users' hands. And in the forest, compliance is a source for learning. Another, I was glad to see, Gita, you brought up that word, the A word. Oh no, we can't talk about accountability. In the desert, accountability is a threat. And it really does mean blame. And when you talk to a desert person about accountability, they immediately flinch because they know that means somebody's going to hold me accountable, which just means they're going to blame me if things go bad. Now, if things go well, I'm never going to see that. But nobody says, well, I'm going to hold you accountable for the fabulous success of this project. No, hell no. But as Gita said, accountability in the forest is a completely different matter. It means, literally, dictionary definition, required to render account. So if I want to be accountable to you for what I and my team did, I render account. I say, we did this, we wasted 2 days doing that, we learned this lesson, we made this mistake, we've changed things like this. That's what we've done. I have rendered account to you, and now you know that you can trust me in a way that you couldn't if I wasn't accountable to you. Accountability in the forest is a trust-building exercise. It's a way of saying to people, this is what I've done with the resources that I have, and now you can trust me in a deeper way than you could if I was off in the corner thinking, well, I hope he doesn't figure out this is what happened. Everybody's better positioned to learn in a world with accountability, but only in the forest. Remember, in the forest, we're assuming that people are innately good, with political exceptions. If people are innately good, then accountability is safe. In the desert, it's not safe, but in the forest, it absolutely is. But again, try and have that conversation about accountability. Talk with a forest person, a desert person when you're in the forest, and they're going to just think that you're crazy. The last one I'm going to talk about is, it's one of my favorite desert stories. So you have projects and they have a status and it's red, yellow, and green, and every 3 months we're going to review all the projects, right? Or every month we're going to review all the projects. You've done this, right? In the desert, you never report green status. If you report status green, then somebody is going to look at that and say, well, there's this red project over here, so I'm going to take your 2 best people and put them on that red project over there. The goal, the skill of the manager in the desert is always reporting yellow status, no matter the actual status of the project. I don't know. I think we might make it if we really stretch. And it doesn't matter how well or poorly things are going. You don't want to be red, so don't report red. You don't want to be green, because then they're going to make it yellow. So you're just going to report yellow and then kind of play it up. Like the doctor who comes in and goes, I'll see what I can do. Probably going to die, but I'll see what I can do. That's the best doctor move, because then if they die, they were going to die anyway, and if they survive, you're a genius. So this is the project management version of that. Yellow, not sure we're going to make it. In the desert, that makes perfect sense, including some very large, oftentimes admired software development organizations. In the forest, though, project status, why would you be so out of touch with the projects that anything they would report in a status meeting, a periodic status meeting, would be any kind of surprise? That would be management malpractice. Not to be aware of what's going on in projects to the degree that you're surprised by, this project's having trouble. So in the forest, you'll report, but why would you even need to? If everyone's paying attention, people know the important information already. But again, try having this conversation between the desert and the forest. Well, what about project status? Why aren't you paying attention? Oh, but and back and forth and back and forth. I went back instead of forward. And then, of course, one moment, please. And this. Okay. I'm giving you a moment to recap. And one of the things I hear from people when I talk about forest and desert now is people say, well, it's really a continuum. And I'm here to say that from my experience, it's really not a continuum. There are two attractors in software development. The desert attractor is really strong. If you're in the desert, it's really hard to get out of it. Now, one of the sad things about the forest is the attraction is not nearly so strong. You can have a very effective software development team, and one thing can change. One person can come in and demand that the code coverage metrics go up, and the whole thing kind of comes apart. Or the first time you offer an honest estimate and you're told that that's the wrong answer. The phrase I remember was, I can't sell that deadline. When's this going to be done? March 1st. I can't sell that deadline. I thought you asked when it was going to be done. And I answered you, in the forest, that just makes no sense. In the desert, it makes some sense. But the first time that happens is the last time you're given an honest estimate. So the forest is more fragile. It's easier to lose it, and it's harder to get it back. But it's absolutely possible. We have seen now 25 years of people working to get out of the desert, and some of them make it, and some of them don't. Some of them are like my friend with the 3 years of really satisfying software development experience, where they get out of it temporarily and then they slide back. If you are in the desert, you can start by just planting a few grasses. There's going to be a succession. You can't just jump right into the forest. It's not going to work. You plant big trees in the desert, they're going to die. Because what makes the forest is the interconnection between the beliefs, the principles, the practices that make up the culture that holds that forest together. But you can, even if you're in the desert, you can start planting a few grasses. And then you're careful to plant them where they're mostly protected. They start growing a little bit. Now an insect lands. Now you got an insect there. Now a bird comes in to eat the insect, and you can plant a shrub, and then the bird eats the seeds from the shrub, and it can grow from there. It's going to take a while. It is very sensitive to regression because the attractor of the desert is very strong. Those beliefs are powerful. Another source of this distinction that came to me just as I was walking around earlier is in the desert, you listen to Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor was a time and motion guy, scientific management, which turns out not to be scientific at all. In the forest, we listen to Mary Parker Follett, who was a contemporary of Taylor's at the same time in New England, but with a very humanistic style of management. Getting from one to the other is possible. It is difficult. There will be so many temptations to slide back, but the consistent experience of folks is the forest produces the cake. The desert produces the crumbs. They're cake crumbs, so they're, as crumbs go, they're pretty good, but it's still crumbs and it's still the floor. The cake on the table, sliced up, served on nice china with a cup of coffee, it's a whole completely different experience. You can get from one to the other. You can stay in the forest, but it's going to be awfully hard work, and it's going to take a while, and nobody likes to hear that answer. And sorry, if there's one thing I've learned over the past 25 years, it is absolutely that. It's going to take a while. It's going to be hard. It'll be easy to backslide, and there's just no alternative. So I would like to thank you all very much for your time and attention. I'll do the modern thing. QR codes are great. They should be more places. I think. I like it. So if you're interested in learning more, that's a place to start. How are we doing on time?
We have 12 minutes.
12 minutes. Do we want to do questions? You're in charge. Sure. Okay, there's time. Let's do questions if anybody has them. Yes, let's get a microphone up here. Since we have time, we can just wait patiently and it'll be fine.
Yeah, so what do you think would be ways to make the forest more robust?
I don't think it can be more robust. I think it's always going to be fragile because we're embedded in this late stage capitalism that creates the incentives to fire a bunch of people and then pretend to be really surprised that they were actually doing work. The stock price went up. He did a good thing. Really? But I think it's always going to be fragile. I think the only thing that would make it not fragile is if it could really outcompete the desert on a consistent basis. If the forest was just required to compete in the market, then yeah, people are going to try and fake it, but you can't really fake it. Interest rates going up. If you haven't thought about the effect of interest rates on your job, think a little bit about it, because we got really used to zero interest rates. It twisted our jobs considerably, and now the rules have changed. So I don't know if that's enough of a change, because the forest has a better net present value than the desert. You earn sooner, you spend later, you grow faster. It really does. And if interest rates aren't zero, that's enough to make a difference at the margin for some places. But I think it's essentially always going to be fragile. There's a question further back.
At what point do you stop planting little blades of grass and start looking for maybe some place where a forest might already exist?
Before I plant the first blade of grass. Over and over again, I think it was the second XP conference, there was a panel about transitioning to XP. And bless his heart, guy raises his hand. He says, yeah, but if you just produce superior results, everyone else will want to be like you, right? And I looked around the room and I said, I see 5 teams represented here. Each of these teams produced far more value, 0 defects, much shorter time, And all 5 teams were fired as a result. Standing out like that, people just aren't going to follow. I think that's why I say, sure, plant the grass, start testing, read tidy first, start doing incremental design. Was that a subtle enough plug? There we go. Pair or mob, help other people, make a habit of helping other people, stop planning for more than half. Here's a simple forest technique that makes no sense in the desert. You never have more than half, never have a plan that's more than half full. Why would you? You know you're not going to get to the second half of any plan, so just don't have it. That makes perfect sense in the forest. That makes no sense whatsoever in the desert, because along is going to come somebody and say, I know how to make this team twice as productive. I'm going to cram twice as much stuff in their plans. Then it doesn't happen, and then you know the rest of that story. So try those things, but there's always, without really strong executive sponsorship, there's always going to be pressure to revert. And the first time you say, yeah, but there's a test broken, I don't want to push this to production. Say, well, can't you just like disable that test or something? You're right out of it. So I would start looking immediately. But find community. Like, don't do this yourself. You can't hold up to the pressure by yourself. Find community, whether it's inside your organization or outside your organization. And learn one, do one, teach two. Did that answer your question? Okay. Do you have a question here? We have time. No rush.
Thank you. I am like one of your friends that you said, the year 2000 and 2002 and 2003 that I had XB1 was the best time I had. And after that, I fell to kind of the world between forest and desert, when people said that they are trying to be agile and try to have value delivery and like all good stuff, but it takes maybe so hard resistance to leave the desert and want to really accept that this is not a good place to go. What would you recommend from those that are live between this world, and how to persuade them, and what are they basically helping them to start to move from desert to forest gradually, and which one to focus first?
So if I understand your question, if you want to move, what do you do first? So I talk to executives first. And I speak in their language. I talk about net present value versus optionality. So the reason that you do software design is to create options for future change. I talk in terms of cake and crumbs. I said, your organization is capable of so much more than you're achieving now. And I can say that regardless of what organization I'm visiting, because everybody is. You're eating crumbs off the floor. I'm offering you cake. It's going to cost you. Sometimes that lands. Sometimes they're happy with crumbs off the floor and not having to change their minds about the innate goodness of human beings or whatever else really fundamental would have to change in order to make that kind of change. But I start by finding people with power and speaking their language.
Thank you very much.
Empathy. God, I wish there was some other answer, but alas. We have time for one more. There's one up here.
You talked a little bit about metrics and KPIs and how they can destroy an organization if you have them as goals. but at the same time about the value of having them as a source for information. For example, when you measured for yourself how often you run the tests. Can you say something more about how can you create an environment where you have the KPIs and metrics to get the information you need and where you can be responsive to them, but without having them as goals?
So when I work inside an OKR kind of organization, I set up the objectives at the beginning of whatever the review cycle is. But I refuse to set KRs. I will report key results at the end of the cycle. I don't know how I'm going to achieve the objective. I want to tell a story about what progress I made towards the objective, and I wrote this many tests, or I reduced the failure rate of this by this much, or I improved the efficiency of this by this much, or I saved this much on hosting costs. I'll report that at the end of the cycle. I think the big mistake, and this is Desert Love's prediction, yeah, but I know that's our objective, but how are you going to achieve it? How the hell would I know? It's January 1st. I'll tell you July 1st what I did. I don't know how I'm going to achieve it, but it's good for me to know, back to purpose, it's good for me to know, should I reduce our AWS costs, or should I make onboarding new employees go 2 days smoother? It's useful to know which of those is the organizational priority. Maybe I don't have the visibility. I could do either, but I can't do both. So I want to have an objective because I want to feel accomplishment when I accomplish something. But I'm not, how's that going to happen? Who knows? Okay, now we're at the end of the cycle. How'd that go? Well, it feels like qualitatively we made progress. Let me tell you that story with some data. That means that I have to collect my key results as I go along. But they're for me. They're not like, did you do it the way we thought you were going to do it? That's desert thinking. Forest thinking is, this is an objective. It's important. We're going to do stuff mostly that pushes towards that objective. And when we're done, it's safe for us to report, okay, we saved this much money. In the desert, if you do that, if you say, well, we saved this much money, somebody's going to give you a stretch goal. Stretch goal is a way of stealing your satisfaction. Well, you did this thing, and it was good, and we all agreed that it was good, but it wasn't good enough. In the desert, that makes sense, right? We got to squeeze everything out of everybody all the time, or else. Now, that's a lie. That or else part is a lie we tell ourselves to reinforce that set of beliefs, principles, and practices. In the forest, that kind of behavior makes no sense. Did that answer your question? All right, super. Again, thank you all very much. Thanks for coming to the conference. Thanks to the conference organizers. And I think there's a bar here someplace, isn't there? Super, thank you.